Hello and welcome to Power Talk. I'm Shireen Bhan. Today we're joined by a very special guest. Shantanu Narayan currently heads the operations at Adobe. Now, he has successfully turned the company around. He's been charting out a growth path for Adobe, which is delivering significant returns. As always, Shantanu, it's a pleasure to have you join us here on CNBC-TV18. If I could start by asking you about the impact of the tax cuts that have been announced by the Trump administration. I understand that it would bring down your effective tax rate quite considerably. What will that mean starting the next financial year in terms of Adobe?
Shireen, it's always wonderful to be on your show. We actually did announce that as a result of the reduced corporate tax that our earnings would grow quite substantially in 2018 and then continue to have a lower tax rate. I think will just continue to improve American competitiveness. The other thing we also announced was that we would be bringing back the money that we had offshore, and that would again allow us to invest in innovation and continued growth for Adobe.
You know, you're talking about investing in innovation. What do you do with all the cash that you're sitting on, Shantanu, in excess of $5 billion? What's the plan in terms of more acquisitions, in terms of the capabilities that you believe you would like to acquire at this point?
The company, Shireen, is focused primarily on long-term growth, and access to capital was something that Adobe had even prior to this repatriation. We've had a long history of stock buybacks as a way of continuing to return excess capital to shareholders, and I think investing in technologies like AI and mobile that we think will continue to drive future growth is also top of mind in terms of our agenda.
You know, since you're talking about driving future growth, Shantanu, let's talk about specific markets. The US is seeing some pretty strong momentum at this point in time. You're seeing across your verticals strong growth as well. What could be the areas of concern, if any? What could be the downside risk to the kind of growth potential that we are currently seeing?
Well, first, I think we're in rarefied atmosphere in that when you look at a company like Adobe and what we are seeing on top-line growth, what we are seeing with respect to bottom-line growth at a very substantial margin, I think, we're a very unique position. I think in terms of, potential concerns that might exist, we look at the two key imperatives for the company, namely empowering people to create and helping businesses transform, and think that they represent tailwinds for many years because that innate desire for whether you're an individual user or whether you're an enterprise to tell your story digitally, and the need for companies to determine whether digital is going to be a tailwind or headwind, we don't think is impacted by the economy. So we'll continue to monitor the economy, but we think that both of the businesses that we have are so fundamental to how individuals and businesses transform that as long as we continue to innovate, we'll see good growth.
Okay, since you're talking about good growth, let me then ask you about the India story, Shantanu. In terms of hiring, in terms of where you see the next drivers for growth coming in, specifically from the India market, you were here last inaugurating your new headquarters in Noida. That's when we last met. Take me through what the picture now looks like when it comes to India.
I think every time I come to India, Shireen, it seems like we're at full capacity, and I know we have this conversation always about, is Adobe giving numbers, but the net is that, if you've seen the incredible success that we've had, that has actually translated into headcount growth in the company, and again, disproportionate headcount growth in India. We have approximately a third of our global employees right now, and the new facility in Noida as well as the new one in Bangalore, I understand are already at capacity. So I think, we continue to be incredibly excited about the talent that's available here. We've also started up a small AI lab here in Hyderabad because there's incredible talent and skills. And so for us, it's always been about quality and this new generation of millennials who have these incredible skills, but we will continue to grow in India. I think another area of growth for India has really been on the digital marketing side, what we've been doing with consulting services as well as what we call customer success managers. So even the field organization has actually seen a significant amount of growth here in India.
Let me continue with that line of questioning then, Shantanu. I've often asked this question of you. Let me try my luck once again. Since you continue to grow in India and the growth has largely been organic, are there any opportunities that look exciting at this point in time that you may want to consider from an inorganic perspective?
Like last time, Shireen, we would love to find technology companies that are innovating. I think as the evolution of the industry in India continues, services is still where there's a tremendous opportunity in terms of talent, but the product innovation in a fundamental way in the areas that are critical for us, namely digital media and digital marketing, there are none, unfortunately, that are on my radar. So if you have some interesting companies, we certainly have the appetite and the capital in order to do it. But unfortunately, we still haven't seen any that really bubble to the top in terms of ones that we would like to put top of our list.
But is
Here
it just
in India, that is.
Is it just a valuation issue, Shantanu?
With respect to the entrepreneurship that we're seeing, I think the entrepreneurship in India is not in the areas that are critical to Adobe's growth, namely analytics, what we're doing with AI, what we're doing around augmented reality and virtual reality. To your question, though, in the US, sometimes valuations have got ahead of themselves. But, you know, if it's the right technology and the right people, we will still, you know, continue to be aggressive about looking at it. We bought some really interesting companies last year that are going to be the basis of some new products that we deliver this year. And so we're constantly looking, but even the organic opportunity at Adobe is so large right now. As long as we continue to deliver against that innovation, we feel very confident about where Adobe is headed.
Okay, Shantanu, you spoke about the artificial intelligence lab that Adobe is setting up here in India. And one of the questions that industry as well as the government is grappling with is what is going to happen a few years down the line? You know, NASSCOM put out a report suggesting that almost 20 to 25% of the current jobs in the IT and the BPO space could be redundant over the next 12 to 18 months. So what do you believe is the need of the hour, and how concerned should we be on account of the impact of AI on jobs?
Well, AI is certainly going to eliminate a lot of the repetitive tasks that happen. And so I think the imperative that the Modi government, as well as here what I hear from the Minister for IT, who's so progressive, Rama Rao, is all about reskilling employees. India stepped up when there was the need for services. The need now is for fundamental product innovation. And I think when you think about AI, it's really about how do you take all of the data that people are collecting and use models to make sense of that data. So new areas like data science, like analytics, like the ability to harness the power of data, those are going to be critical. And I think it's imperative that our educational institutions focus a lot more on these new skills. You know, innovation and evolution are just a natural form of what happens in societies. And I think it's, again, imperative that we stay ahead of it.
Well, Shantanu, let me ask you then, what are you most excited about in 2018? You know, from a strategy perspective, things are falling into place for you. They've been delivering returns. But today, what are you most excited about?
Well, I think, you know, this area that we call the experience wave, which is if the first generation of enterprise software was automating the back office, ERP, and the second generation was automating the front office with productivity, helping all of the leaders in industry and government deal with what we are calling the experience wave, which is how do you step up to meet customer and consumer expectations, is, I think, going to be an area of explosive growth for us. On digital media, I look at augmented reality and I look like technologies like voice and the ability for people to speak more to computers and for it to infer based on prior history through AI what you can do. Those are perhaps two areas that, you know, from Adobe, I continue to be excited about. More generally, I just believe that the ability for healthcare to be transformed through the use of technology and pattern recognition is an area that I think will help all societies in a meaningful way.
Okay, Shantanu, I'll end then by asking you, you know, through 2017, the concerns surrounding the uncertainty about possible changes with visas in the US weighed down tech companies. Specifically, of course, the sentiment here in India was under pressure on account of that. But do you believe that that threat has diminished somewhat today?
My continued belief is that, companies like Adobe focus on ensuring that we're a global company, whether it's where we recruit our talent, whether it's where we sell our services. And I'm actually confident that all governments, including the US and including India, will continue to recognize that for competitiveness in the global economy, that you need to ensure that US-based companies, if you're in the US, have access to global talent and global markets. And so I'm confident that it'll work itself out. But as you know, I'm an optimist, and I continue to focus on how we can drive growth for Adobe.
Well, you are an optimist, and it's working for you, Shantanu. Always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18. Shantanu Narayan there, taking us through Adobe's action plan for 2018. We are going to take a break, but when we return, my exclusive chat with the executive chairman of Honeywell, the industrial giant. That's coming up after the break. Dave, thanks very much for joining us on CNBC TV18. It's always good to have you on the program. Before I talk to you about technology and disruptions, let me ask you about the big tax cut announced by President Trump in America and what the impact is likely to be on corporate America and also US companies operating in emerging markets like India. Do you foresee significant restructuring of operations? What is the impact of the tax cuts on business?
Oh, I think the tax cut overall is going to be beneficial, not just for business, but for all the people that are employed by businesses. So I think it's actually going to be a good phenomenon. I don't think it really has an impact on international trade in any way or movement of factories one way or the other. This is just a case of putting more money in the pockets of companies for them to be able to invest. And if they invest more, then employees will do better. And I would say it's pretty much as straightforward as that. I do worry about the long-term effect of it in terms of the impact it has on our overall debt. Our annual deficits are going to increase. Our debt, which is already high, is going to get higher. It could accelerate a potential debt crisis. But at least in the short term, it should be a boost. It should be a boost to the U.S. economy, which should be helpful to the world.
In the short term, you expect the U.S. economy to benefit from the tax cuts, Dave. How confident do you feel of the growth momentum that we're currently seeing in the U.S. being able to sustain itself?
Oh, I think economic growth in the U.S. should be in that, my guess, 2.5% range could go on for another 4 or 5 years. This year might be a little higher because of the tax cut impact, but over time, it's tough to see right now, other than some big geopolitical event, what could possibly bring it down. Because consumer balance sheets are in good shape, bank balance sheets are in good shape, corporate balance sheets are in good shape, capacity utilization across the U.S. is still low. There's still plenty of room for it to grow. So it's tough to point to what the potential problem is. So I would say it could go on like this for another, 3 to 5 years. We'll see, though. The world has an interesting way of evolving very differently than we all forecast. But right now, I'd say things could look pretty good for a while.
Right. As you pointed out, Dave, we do live in dynamic times. The last time you and I chatted, the threat of protectionism of countries like the U.S. looking more inwards was a real threat. Do you believe that that has diminished from the last time we spoke?
Well, I would say the amount of globalization hasn't really changed, but the attitude towards globalization has been changing a lot. And as you know, protectionism exists in every country, and it's particularly robust in India, as you very well know. So I'm hopeful that over time, tempers will cool a little bit. It seems like every country seems to feel like they are a victim of globalization because they can see the downsides that have occurred, but they don't see the upsides that have also occurred for them. And this is one where we need to, as countries, all of us, start pointing out to the benefits of trade in addition to the things where it does hurt. The problem that you run into with any country is it's easy to see the hurt generally. It's more specific. A plant is closed. It's difficult to see the benefit that accrues to everybody else because it's a small piece that in the U.S. goes to 300 million people. Collectively, it adds up to a lot more than what that single point was. But the hurt is very specific, very visible. The benefit is very diffused and invisible, but it is real and it is there. The same is true in India. And India has historically a problem with protectionism, and you can see it in retail, you can see it in agriculture. If you really want a country to progress, those things need to start to open. So I'm hopeful that across the world, people start looking at how do we make sure that trade benefits everybody. And when I say that, I don't mean to get hung up on it's got to benefit us to the exclusion of the other guys. Recognize there's a give and take, and on balance, everybody comes up. And that, I'm hoping that we return to that kind of dynamic as a world, not just in the U.S., not just in India, but everywhere.
You know, Dave, in our last interview, you said, and something that I always remember, that capital is a coward and it goes where it feels safe. As you look at the world today, in terms of Honeywell or other US companies making investments into emerging markets like India, India is a country that you know very well. Do you believe that given what is happening in the US, the strength and the recovery of the economy, plus the tax cuts, we are going to see, the flow of dollars into emerging markets perhaps ebb?
I would think not. What we refer to as high growth regions, of which China and India are a part, are becoming a more and more important part of the world. And if you want some statistics, 1990, high growth regions represented about 24% of global GDP. In 2010, they represented about 34% of global GDP. In 20 years, high growth regions will be a little more than 50% of global GDP. Not global GDP growth, actual global GDP. And when you're faced with that kind of dynamic, you have to invest. Now, each country will be different. So in some cases, you may say, I'm just going to invest in salespeople. Others, you might say, salespeople in a warehouse. If you start to feel safe about the country, you'll say salespeople, warehouse, and a factory. And it's going to differ by country, but the safer each country is, the more they make capital feel safe, the greater the chance that you're going to see investment in factories and long-term jobs. Because if you're someone like me, and you have to decide where to put a factory, and it has to last for 20 or 30 years, you want to make sure there's going to be continuity to good government and to safety of that capital.
Let me end then by asking you, Dave, you've always been bullish on India and the India story. As you look at where things are today in India, what's your own sense of the strength of the growth momentum and your own, Honeywell's own sort of story here in India?
Well, our Honeywell story, as you know, is quite good. We've gone from about 500 people 15 years ago to over 13,000 today. And the economy is finally starting to really move again, and we're going to be able to benefit from that also. My big hope for the country is if you go back to the 1990s when Manmohan Singh was finance minister, he was able to get through a number of changes that allowed the country to grow faster for a good period of time, and the country benefited. But the country let up, government let up, and nobody really pushed more change. It was like that was enough. So then we ended up in this kind of stultifying period where nothing was really happening, the bureaucracy was taking over, and the economy wasn't growing. Well, PM Modi, who I hope you appreciate that I'm channeling with my beard, I'm a big fan of PM Modi, he instituted a number of changes again, which are again causing the economy to grow. But if people and the government start to feel like they're done, they've done enough because the economy is growing, well, the same darn thing is going to happen again. It will just level off. The change has to still keep coming, and there's a significant amount of change that still needs to occur in the country. The bureaucracy is just stifling, absolutely stifling. Retail needs to be expanded and made more competitive. Protectionism needs to disappear. Education and broadband, like we just talked about. All these things still need to happen. And I'm hopeful that people will support PM Modi's government and make these changes continue to happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years so that economic progress continues. So I'm a big fan in the possibility of what can happen in India, but those government changes need to keep happening.
Dave Cote, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18, and we appreciate your time.